The cruelest lies are often the ones disguised as love, the kind that wrap themselves around your heart with the gentle hands of a lover or the familiar voice of family, until one day you realize the warmth was just the friction of the rope binding you. I learned this not in some grand tragedy, but in the quiet, brittle aftermath of my mother's funeral, where the scent of lilies couldn't mask the stench of greed, and where the reading of a will felt less like a distribution of assets and more like a sentencing. My name is Evelyn Hales, and in the eyes of the world, I was the lesser twin, the quiet daughter, the overlooked one. While my brother, Daniel, received the keys to 3 luxurious mansions and the throne of our family's empire, I was given a single faded painting of a lighthouse, a bequest so pitiful it drew laughter from my own husband. They thought it was the punchline to a cruel joke, the final proof of my insignificance. What they didn't understand, what they could never have anticipated as they toasted their victory with my mother's expensive whiskey, was that she hadn't left me a piece of art. She had left me a map. And buried within the cracked frame of that forgotten seascape was a rusted key, a slip of paper with a bank box number, and the first whisper of a truth so explosive it would unravel their perfect poisonous world. They believed they had divided a fortune that day, but in their arrogance, they failed to see the most valuable inheritance of all wasn't in deeds or dividends. It was hidden in plain sight, waiting for the one person they'd written off to finally look past the canvas and see the storm raging beneath. The church bells that day tolled with a heaviness that seemed to press the gray November sky lower over the gathered mourners. Rain, fine and cold, dripped from the black umbrellas clustered around my mother's grave, turning the manicured cemetery path into rivulets of mud. I stood apart, my hands clenched around a single white rose, feeling nothing but a vast, hollow numbness. My grief was a silent, private thing, buried too deep to access. Daniel, of course, performed his with theatrical perfection. His sobs were loud, wrenching, and perfectly timed, each one a performance for the audience of family friends and business associates. His tears looked expensive somehow, as if even his sorrow had been tailored and polished. Our mother, Marian Hales, the fierce, elegant woman who had steered the family business through recessions with a smile that never quite reached her tired eyes, was gone. I had always thought of her as unshakable, a fixed point in a chaotic universe. To see her name carved into cold granite made the world feel dangerously loose, as if the axis had tilted. Daniel put a heavy, proprietary arm around my shoulders as the priest's final words faded into the damp air. "You okay, Evie?" he asked, his voice a stage whisper of concern. I nodded stiffly. "You don't look fine," he pressed, squeezing just a bit too hard. "But don't worry, I'll take care of everything, just like Mom wanted." The phrase was a barbed hook, just like Mom wanted. I remained silent, watching the last shovelful of dark earth fall into the polished coffin, wondering if he believed even half of what he said. The family lawyer, Mr. Benton, approached with the somber demeanor of his profession. "Mr. and Mrs. Hales," he began, addressing Daniel and his wife Tessa before his gaze flickered to me, "the reading of your mother's will is scheduled for this afternoon at the residence. If you'd like a few hours to—" Daniel cut him off with a wave. "No need for that, Benton. Let's get it over with." He turned to me, his smile thin and devoid of warmth. "You're coming, I assume." It wasn't a question. I merely nodded, my throat too tight for words. My husband, Marcus, materialized from the crowd, his phone still in his hand, as if the funeral had been a minor interruption in his day. "Rough," he said, by way of condolence, slipping the device into his pocket. "You're ready to go? I'm starving." The casual cruelty of his self-absorption stole my breath. "It's not about food, Marcus. We're going to the will reading." He shrugged, already turning toward the car. "Maybe she left you something nice, huh?" he said, the comment hanging between a joke and a hope. The family mansion, perched on a hill overlooking the town, felt like a museum of a life already archived. The air inside was still and carried the faint, ghostly scent of my mother's perfume and the beeswax used on the grand piano no one had played in years. In the formal sitting room, Mr. Benton had laid out his documents with legal precision. Daniel was already pouring himself a generous measure of our mother's best single malt. Tessa lounged beside him, engrossed in her phone. The performance was underway. To my beloved son Daniel Hales, I leave the 3 residential properties located in Maplewood, Crestview, and Lakehurst. In addition, full control of Hales Enterprises and all associated shares. Daniel couldn't suppress a grin, raising his glass in a silent, smug toast. He mouthed, "Knew she loved me best." My heart was a frantic bird in my chest as I waited. To my daughter, Evelyn Hales, I leave one item of personal significance, a painting titled The Light Keeper, located in my private study. It is my wish that she keep it safe. The silence that followed was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. Daniel's attempt to stifle a laugh came out as a snort. Tessa didn't bother to hide hers, a sharp, derisive sound. Marcus blinked, then let out a short, disbelieving chuckle. "Wait, that's it? A painting?" Mr. Benton looked profoundly uncomfortable. Daniel leaned forward, a mask of faux concern plastered on his face. "Evelyn, that must be disappointing. But hey, art can be valuable, right?" "Sure," chimed Marcus, a smirk twisting his lips. "If you can find someone who wants a dead woman's wall decoration." Humiliation burned my cheeks. I looked down at my hands, my voice a fragile thread. She must have had her reasons. Tessa tilted her head, her tone dripping with faux sweetness. "Probably sentimental. Some people only get attached to useless things." As the formalities concluded, Mr. Benton handed me a small, unmarked beige envelope. "Your mother requested I give this to you directly." I took it, my fingers trembling. Marcus scoffed as I opened it to find a seemingly blank piece of paper. Even her secret letters are empty. But as I tilted the page toward the gray light from the window, faint, watermark-like words shimmered into view. "When darkness wins, follow the light keeper's path." I retreated to the study, the one room that still felt like her. The painting hung in its accustomed place above the marble fireplace. It was a somber, beautiful piece, a solitary figure holding a lantern aloft on a storm-battered cliff, the beacon cutting a brave swath through the oppressive night. I remembered sitting beneath it as a child, listening to my mother's stories. "A light keeper never abandons the tower," she'd say, her voice soft but firm, "no matter how dark the night gets." Marcus found me there, the sharp scent of whiskey preceding him. "You're really taking that thing, huh?" "It's what she left me." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You sure she didn't just forget to throw it out?" The argument escalated, his words becoming weapons honed on resentment and cheap liquor. He mocked my grief, my loyalty, my very worth. "Maybe your mom finally saw the truth," he sneered, his eyes glazed. "She saw you for what you are." Something in me, long suppressed, finally snapped. "You don't know anything about her." "I know she loved Daniel more," he shot back. "That's all there is to understand." In a final, drunken act of contempt, he yanked the painting from the wall, declaring he'd throw the piece of trash away himself. As he flung it across the room, it struck the corner of a heavy oak table with a sickening crack. Not of the canvas, but of the old, sturdy frame splitting open, and from within that cleft, something metallic glinted, falling to the floor with a soft, definitive clink. Time seemed to slow. I knelt, my breath held, and pried the broken wood apart. There, amidst the splinters, lay a small, tarnished bronze key, and nestled beside it, folded tightly, was a yellowed slip of paper. My hands shook as I unfolded it. 2 lines, written in my mother's elegant script. "Bank of Hales, Box 317. I looked up, a wild, desperate hope flaring in my chest. "Marcus, this is—" But he was already there, his hand closing over the key on the floor, his expression shifting from drunken belligerence to something calculating and sharp. "A bank box," he said softly, almost to himself. Then he looked at me, and the mask slipped back into place, but colder now. "It's probably nothing, some old paperwork." He pocketed the key. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I heard him leave. The digital clock read 2:17 a.m. He returned before dawn, smelling of cold night air and expensive cologne, whispering, "Sleep well, sweetheart," as if blessing a fool. He thought I was asleep. He thought I was blind. The theft was systematic. When I dared to visit the bank, the clerk informed me the box had been emptied and closed by my husband, my representative. My room at his sterile apartment was later ransacked. Any personal papers of my mother's vanished. Yet, in his arrogance, he left one trail untended: my own memories. I recalled a photograph buried in an old album at the mansion. My mother, young and windswept, standing before a majestic white lighthouse on a rocky promontory. On the back, in pencil, Lightkeeper Hill, 1983, for my daughter when she's ready. The name was a spark in the darkness. I confronted Marcus, my voice trembling but clear. The documents from the bank, the estate paperwork, it was called Lightkeeper Hill, wasn't it? He froze, the lie forming on his lips, but his eyes gave him away. The game was up. He and Daniel were already in motion, transferring the deed, solidifying their theft. I followed them, a ghost in my own life, and saw them at the very estate, laughing with surveyors on the porch of a breathtaking coastal manor that belonged, by right and by my mother's true intent, to me. The confrontation was brutal. "You're trespassing," Marcus stated flatly, as Daniel looked on with icy amusement. The word was a knife to the heart. As I turned to leave, defeated and broken, an elderly woman emerged from the garden shadows, Mrs. Lorne, the caretaker. She pressed a sealed envelope in my hand and whispered words that would become my mantra. "Don't fight. Wait." Her letter was a revelation that shattered my remaining illusions. Daniel was not my blood brother. He was adopted, a secret my mother had kept to protect the family name, a secret he had later used to blackmail her, forcing her to rewrite her will. Marcus had been his accomplice from the beginning, seeing in my family's discord a path to wealth. The letter ended with a clue. I hid proof of everything inside the chest under the study floor. With Mrs. Lorne's help, I returned to Lightkeeper Hill under cover of darkness. We found the chest, a rusted metal box buried beneath the floorboards of the estate's study. Inside were my mother's journals, cassette tapes of her private testimonies, and the original, untainted will. It was a trove of truth. And then Marcus and Daniel found us. What followed was a scene of pure, petty malice. Marcus, in a rage, tore the journals and threw the tapes into the lit fireplace, watching years of my mother's courage turn to ash, while Daniel held me back. "You have nothing left," he spat, his laughter echoing as they left me kneeling in the ruins. But in the fire's dying glow, I saw it, a faint seam in the wall paneling, a hidden compartment, untouched by their fury. Within it was a single silver USB drive labeled simply, "For my daughter." On that drive was my mother's final, meticulous defense, video depositions given under oath detailing the coercion and fraud, recordings of Daniel's threats, of Marcus's conspiratorial negotiations with the corrupt family lawyer. It was all there, digitized and duplicated, a truth they could not burn. I took it to the one attorney my mother had trusted implicitly, a man Daniel hadn't managed to replace. The wheels of justice, once greased with truth, began to turn with astonishing speed. But justice in a courtroom was not enough. I needed a reckoning they couldn't lawyer their way out of. I invited them to Lightkeeper Hill for a final discussion. They arrived, arrogant and assured, expecting a surrender. What they walked into was a live-streamed confession chamber. As we sat at a tense candlelit dinner, I played my mother's videos on a projector. Their faces, captured by hidden cameras, paled as her voice filled the room, outlining their crimes. When I revealed the feed was broadcasting live to investors, the board, and the authorities, their alliance fractured spectacularly. Greed and fear turned on each other, their shouted accusations and physical struggle providing the world with all the evidence it needed. The police, tipped off anonymously, arrived to find them brawling amid the wreckage of their own making. The aftermath played out in headlines and court transcripts, convictions for fraud, forgery, and blackmail. The Hale Empire, built on my mother's work and corrupted by their deceit, crumbled. The estates were returned, the company stabilized under new stewardship. But the greatest victory was not in reclaiming bricks and mortar or stock portfolios. It was in the stillness that followed. I restored Lightkeeper Hill, not as a monument to wealth, but as a sanctuary. I established the Lightkeeper Foundation within its walls, a place for those, like me, who had to rebuild their lives after profound betrayal. The repaired painting hangs in my office, the steadfast keeper with his lantern a constant reminder. Sometimes, on clear evenings, I climb the path to the actual lighthouse on the cliff's edge. The beam cuts through the darkness, a defiant circle of light over the restless sea. Standing there, the salt wind on my face, I finally understand my mother's true bequest. She didn't leave me a painting or a house or a fortune. She left me a purpose, a torch passed in the silent language of love and warning. She left me the light. And in the end, that was the only inheritance that could never be stolen, tarnished, or broken. It was mine alone to keep, and mine alone to hold high against the gathering dark. The quiet after the storm is a sound all its own, a profound and humming stillness where the echoes of shattered things finally settle, and you are left alone in the space they once occupied. For a long time, in the wake of Marcus and Daniel's arrest and the ensuing media cyclone, I existed in that quiet, moving through the reclaimed rooms of Lightkeeper Hill like a curator in a museum of my own past. The foundation's work began in earnest, the legal transfers, the renovations to turn opulent bedrooms into counseling suites and sun-drenched solariums into communal spaces. But my own heart felt like one of the estate's many closed-off wings, dusty and full of forgotten furniture. I had won. I had exposed the lie and reclaimed my legacy. Yet victory, I discovered, is not a destination, but a new landscape, and this one was strewn with the emotional wreckage they had left behind. The world saw Evelyn Hales, the triumphant daughter who had outsmarted the corrupt men in her life. I saw a woman who had to learn how to trust the feel of a doorknob in her own home again, who flinched at unexpected letters, and whose dreams were still patrolled by the sound of Marcus's mocking laughter. The foundation was my penance and my purpose, a way to transmute my private hurt into a public shelter. But the alchemy was slow, and some nights the loneliness felt heavier than any deceit. It was Mrs. Lorne who became my anchor in those months. She moved from the caretaker's cottage into the main house, a steady, silent presence who communicated more with a pot of tea or a freshly opened window than with words. She had been my mother's confessor and keeper of secrets. Now she became mine. One rainy afternoon, as we sorted through yet another box of my mother's personal effects, this one filled with old travel journals and pressed wildflowers, she paused, holding up a small, leather-bound datebook from the year I turned 10. "She wrote about you constantly, you know," Mrs. Lorne said, her voice soft. "Not as the daughter she had to protect, but as the person she most admired. 'Evelyn has a quiet steel in her,' she wrote once. 'Daniel shouts to prove his strength. Evelyn simply is strong, and the world hasn't realized it yet.'" I took the diary, the familiar script blurring as my eyes filled. It was a different kind of truth, more nourishing and more devastating than any evidence of fraud. It was the truth of a mother's seeing love, a love I had doubted in my darkest hours. That little book became a talisman, a proof against the poison they had tried to inject into my history. The legal proceedings were a distant, grinding machine. Marcus, in a final, desperate gambit, tried to plead a case of marital coercion, claiming he was unduly influenced by Daniel. Daniel, in turn, painted Marcus as the master manipulator who had preyed on a grieving family. Watching their mutual destruction play out in sterile courtroom statements was like watching two scorpions in a jar. There was a grim satisfaction, but no joy.
Their sentences were substantial, a number of years that felt both like a lifetime and not nearly enough. The day the final gavel fell, I did not go to the courthouse. I stood instead on the cliffs of Lightkeeper Hill, the wind whipping my hair, and I spoke my mother's name into the void. There was no cathartic shout, no tears of relief, just a slow, steady exhalation, as if I had been holding my breath since the day of the funeral. It was over. And now, somehow, I had to begin. The Foundation's first residents arrived, women with stories written in the shadows under their eyes and a wariness in their posture I recognized intimately. Helping them was not an act of charity, it was a form of kinship. We did not talk of our betrayals in grandiose terms, but in the quiet, practical language of recovery. How to sleep through the night, how to manage finances they were never allowed to touch, how to silence the internal voice that echoed a tormentor's words. In teaching them to reclaim their light, I was slowly, painstakingly relighting my own. I began to make changes to the estate that were purely for me, not for legacy or atonement. I turned the formal, unused drawing room into a library with deep, comfortable chairs and the smell of old paper. I planted a wild, unruly garden of native flowers where the pristine rose bushes had been, a riot of color and life that required no meticulous control. The world outside began to see me differently, too. The narrative shifted from wronged heiress to philanthropic founder. I was invited to speak at events, to sit on panels. I declined most offers, but accepted one, a small, prestigious award for ethical leadership in business. The ceremony was in the city, in a glittering hotel ballroom I had last entered on Daniel's arm years before. Walking in alone, in a simple dark gown, my heart was a frantic drum. But as I accepted the award, I scanned the crowd and found not judgment or pity, but respect. I spoke not of fraud or vengeance, but of integrity as a daily practice, of building structures that shelter rather than exclude. Afterward, a man approached me, older, with kind eyes and the calm demeanor of a seasoned diplomat. He introduced himself as Alastair Reed, a friend of my mother's from her early days in business. I was so sorry to hear of Marion's passing, but seeing you here tonight, she would utterly be proud. Not just of what you've accomplished, but of who you are, Evelyn. You have her resilience, but you have your own light, Evelyn. Never doubt that. His words, free of agenda or flattery, settled something deep within me. It was the first conversation in years that felt unburdened by history. Back at Lightkeeper Hill, life developed a new rhythm. The Foundation thrived, its success stories my greatest reward. I developed a friendship with a local marine biologist, Claire, who was studying the coastal ecosystem. She was brilliant, fiercely independent, and had no interest in my family name or history, only in my thoughts on turning a section of the estate's shoreline into a protected conservation area. Our collaborations over tide charts and grant proposals were a joyful intellectual reprieve. Through her, I began to engage with the living world around me, the migration patterns of seabirds, the secret life of tidal pools, finding a sense of scale and continuity that dwarfed my personal dramas. Nearly 2 years after the trial, a letter arrived. It was from Marcus, forwarded by his lawyer. My first instinct was to burn it unopened, but a cold curiosity and the hard-won knowledge that running from a ghost only gives it power made me slice the envelope open. His writing was neat, controlled, devoid of the emotional sloppiness of his drunken rages. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not proclaim innocence. Instead, he wrote of the endless, echoing boredom of his confinement, of the books he was reading, of the stark clarity that comes when every mirror is taken away. The last paragraph was the only one that gave me pause. I convinced myself I was building a fortress out of what I took from you. I see now I was only ever constructing my own cage. The cruelest joke is that you held the key to my freedom all along, not the metal one in the painting, but the simple act of walking away from the man I was when I was with you. I am not writing for absolution. I am writing to say I finally see the painting. The light keeper isn't waiting for a ship, he's keeping the flame alive for its own sake. That's what you did. I am sorry I tried to blow it out. I read it once, then placed it in the small cast-iron wood stove in my library. I watched paper blacken and curl, the words dissolving into heat and light. There was no fury, no pity, just a final, quiet release. The apology changed nothing, but its acknowledgement of my truth meant the war was truly, finally over. He had surrendered not to me, but to reality. On the anniversary of my mother's passing, I did not visit the cemetery. I felt her presence more potently in the places she had loved. I spent the morning with Mrs. Lorne, planting a young dogwood tree in the wild garden, its spring blossoms a promise of soft, white light. In the afternoon, I climbed to the lighthouse. I had taken over its maintenance myself, polishing the great Fresnel lens until it shone, ensuring the automated mechanism was sound. As dusk painted the sky in watercolor hues of violet and gold, I manually lit the old secondary lamp, a symbolic gesture, as the modern beacon would soon click on automatically. Standing in the glow, the vast, darkening sea stretching to the horizon, I felt a profound peace. The journey had begun with a key hidden in a broken frame, a secret meant for my hands alone. It led me through a labyrinth of deception to this wind-swept point of clarity. I had inherited not just an estate, but a mission, not just a fortune, but a fortified self. The light I tended now was both a memory and a living thing, a beam cast for the lost, the healing, and the yet to be found. And as the first star pierced the indigo canopy above, I understood my mother's last, greatest lesson. The most powerful legacy is not what is left to you, but what you choose to build from the ashes. The lightkeeper's path is walked alone, but the light itself belongs to anyone brave enough to look toward the shore. That peace, hard-won and crystalline, did not imply a life without motion. The sea below the cliffs was my new tutor, teaching me that stillness and tumult are not opposites, but partners in a perpetual, breathing dance. The foundation, named the Lightkeeper's Trust, became less of a refuge and more of a port, a place where women didn't just come to hide, but to repair their hulls, recalibrate their compasses, and plot new courses. We expanded, adding a small legal advocacy office and partnering with local colleges for vocational training. My days were filled with the mundane poetry of administration, budget spreadsheets that sang of independence, supply orders for art therapy materials that whispered of healing, and the endless, rewarding negotiation of human hope meeting practical constraint. Claire, the marine biologist, became a constant. Our friendship, forged over soil samples and funding proposals, deepened into something unshakable. She was the first person since my mother who looked at me and saw not a victim or a victor, but simply Evelyn, a woman who liked terrible detective novels, had a questionable taste in old jazz records, and could kill a potted fern with a single glance. Her laughter, loud and unself-conscious, became a sound that filled the old house's hollow spaces, scattering the ghosts with its sheer, vibrant force. It was Claire who nudged me, 2 years after the trial's closure, toward a project I'd been mentally circling but emotionally avoiding. "The West Wing is just sitting where," she said one evening, her boots propped on my desk as we reviewed blueprints for the conservation area. "All those rooms facing the sea. It's not just space, Ev, it's potential. You could run artist residencies. Imagine writers and painters here, soaking up this view, turning it into something new." The idea thrilled and terrified me. Opening the physical heart of the estate, the most private rooms, to strangers, felt like a vulnerability I wasn't sure I could afford. But as I walked through the dusty, sun-slatted corridors of the West Wing, I saw not just empty rooms, but vessels waiting for stories. I saw my mother walking these halls, not as the burdened matriarch, but as the young woman who had bought this place as a secret sanctuary for her own spirit. The residency program, the Marian Fellowship, became my next act of reclamation. It was no longer about defending a legacy, but about sharing its inspiration. The first fellows arrived the following spring. A sculptor working with reclaimed ocean plastic, a poet grappling with themes of silence and voice, and a composer capturing the sounds of the coast. Their presence was transformative. The estate, which had known so much whispered deceit, now echoed with the clatter of sculpture tools, the tap of typewriter keys, and snatches of experimental melody. I found myself in quiet, profound conversations at the terrace at dusk, discussing not trauma or law, but the struggle to give form to feeling, the terror of the blank page, the courage it takes to create something from nothing. In their artistic struggles, I saw echoes of my own. I had rebuilt a life. They were building worlds. It was humbling and exhilarating. It was during this vibrant, busy time that a different kind of letter arrived, one that tugged at a thread I thought was permanently woven into the tapestry of my past. It was from a law firm in Zurich, polite and opaque, regarding a matter of custodianship pertaining to the late Marion Hales, potentially involving assets outside previous probate considerations. My first reaction was a cold spike of suspicion, a relic of old wars. Had Daniel or Marcus left some hidden trap, a dormant shell company, a final poisoned pill? Mrs. Lauren, seeing the tension in my shoulders, simply poured a brandy and said, "Or perhaps it's a final gift. Your mother was always 3 steps ahead." With Claire by my side for moral support, I arranged a video conference with the Swiss lawyers. The man who appeared on screen, Herr Schneider, was elderly and impeccably courteous. "Frau Hales," he began, "your mother engaged our firm many years ago. She was a woman of great foresight. She established a blind trust, a vehicle entirely separate from the Hales estate, funded quietly over decades from a portion of her personal holdings from before her marriage." He adjusted his glasses. "She was explicit. This trust was never to be revealed unless 2 conditions were met. First, that her son Daniel attempt to illegitimately claim the Lightkeeper Hill property, and second, that her daughter Evelyn successfully secure it in her own name. The first condition triggered our monitoring. The second, confirmed by the court records you prevailed in, triggers the dissolution of the trust and the transfer of its assets to you." I was speechless. Claire's hand found mine, a warm, grounding pressure. What are the assets?" I finally managed. Herr Schneider permitted himself a small, professional smile. "The trust's primary holding is a minority but significant stake in Vanthau ACI, a privately held Swiss engineering firm specializing in sustainable energy and water purification systems. It is not a controlling interest, but it is a substantial one. The annual dividends alone are considerable. There are also several curated investment portfolios." He named a figure that made the room tilt. It was not the staggering, showy wealth of the Hales empire, but something far more potent, profound, self-generating security. My mother hadn't just hidden a house, she had hidden a future. "Why?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. Herr Schneider's expression softened. "She instructed me to tell you, should this day come, that this was not an inheritance from a mother to a daughter. It was an investment from one woman of substance to another." She said, "Tell Evelyn this is for the projects that have no board of directors, the ones that are just between her and her conscience." The weight of this final, breathtaking act of faith was overwhelming. It was her ultimate message. You are not just the heir to what was, you are the architect of what can be. The money meant freedom on a scale I'd never contemplated, not for luxury, but for impact. The Lightkeeper's Trust could become endowed in perpetuity. The conservation project could purchase and protect miles of coastline. The residencies could expand, offering full scholarships to artists from backgrounds of adversity. This was no longer about survival or even stability. It was about scale, about legacy in its truest sense, not what you keep, but what you enable. With this new compass, my life's work deepened and widened. The foundation launched initiatives for financial literacy, specifically for women rebuilding their lives. We funded microloans for local female entrepreneurs. The estate became a hub, not just for healing, but for burgeoning enterprise. I found myself traveling, not to defend my past, but to learn from others building similar futures, visiting land trusts in Scotland, women's cooperatives in Denmark, bringing ideas back to our cliffs. I was no longer Evelyn Hales, the betrayed twin. I was Evelyn Hales, the steward. The distinction was everything.
Years flowed like the coastal seasons, marked not by drama, but by quiet growth. Mrs. Lorne passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the garden she had helped me plant. We buried her ashes under the dogwood tree, which by then bloomed with extravagant abundance each spring. Her absence was a deep ache, but her presence was woven into the very stones of the place. Claire's conservation project was a wild success, the protected coastline now a thriving sanctuary for species we had thought were in retreat. Our friendship, that steady anchor, slowly, naturally blossomed into a love as deep and enduring as the bedrock beneath the lighthouse. It was a love built not on rescue or need, but on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the immense comfort of being truly known. We married in a simple ceremony on the cliff path, with the sea as our witness and the fellows playing a composition written for the day. The ring she placed on my finger was forged from silver recovered from a shipwreck off the coast, something beautiful salvaged from a deep historic loss. It felt like a perfect metaphor. One autumn evening, many years later, I stood at the lighthouse lantern room, now automated but still maintained with ceremonial care. Claire was below, hosting a dinner for the newest cohort of Marian Fellows. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of laughter. I looked out at the dark water, pricked with the running lights of a single, distant container ship. My mind drifted back to the quay, the broken frame, the ashes in the fireplace, the desperate hope in the caretaker's cottage. The journey from that shattered woman to the one standing here now felt epic, yet simple. The villains of my story were shadows now, their power dissolved, their names rarely spoken. They had tried to define me by what they could take from me. In the end, they had only succeeded in showing me all that I was and all that I could give. The true inheritance was never the painting, the house, or the Swiss trust. It was the revelation of my own strength, passed from my mother's hand to mine in a language of symbols and secrets. It was the understanding that a lightkeeper's power is not in fighting the storm, but in maintaining the flame through it, ensuring that when the clouds part, the guiding light remains steady and sure. My light was no longer just a memory or a defense. It was a signal, a welcome, a fixed point for others navigating their own treacherous waters. And as the great beam swept its arc over the restless, star-flecked blackness, I knew with absolute certainty that the light I kept was no longer just my own. It was ours. It was for anyone lost at sea, searching for a shore, and it would burn, unwavering, long after my watch was over. The arc of a life, I have learned, is not a straight line from shadow into light, but a widening spiral where each turn revisits the old darkness from a higher vantage, with more light at your back to cast upon it. The decades at Lightkeeper Hill were not a placid idyll, but a continuous, gentle unfurling, like the fern fronds that emerged each spring from the damp cliffs. Claire and I built a life in the honest, unglamorous language of shared coffee mugs, of finishing each other's sentences over grant proposals, of silent walks where our clasped hands spoke volumes. Our love was the quiet engine of everything, the stable ground from which all other growth sprung. The foundation's work evolved, its successes measured not in headlines, but in quiet transformations. The woman who arrived with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and left 5 years later as the manager of her own thriving bakery in the village.
The artist who processed her trauma into a series of paintings that now hung in a national gallery. The countless children who came on school trips to the conservation area and left with a new, fierce love for the wild world. These were the dividends of my mother's secret trust, the interest compounded in human potential. The world outside moved on. Daniel served his sentence and, upon release, vanished into obscurity under a new name, a rumor of a man running a modest import business in a country far from the sea. I felt nothing when I heard. No schadenfreude, no pity. He was simply a closed chapter. His ink faded to irrelevance. Marcus, I learned through the unavoidable grapevine of mutual acquaintances, had a harder time of it. The arrogance that had been his armor did not serve him in a world where he was no one. He drifted, a ghost of his own former pretensions. One stark, rainy Tuesday, a brief notice in the paper announced his death from complications following a brief illness. It was a solitary, unremarkable end. I read the line 3 times, waiting for a feeling to surface. There was only a vast, neutral emptiness, like staring at the space where a demolished building once stood. That night, I walked to the cliff's edge. I did not think of him, but of the young woman I had been, the one who believed his love was a shelter. I whispered a release, not for him, but for her. The wind took the words and scattered them over the waves. As the years layered upon themselves, I began to feel a new responsibility taking shape within me, not just to tend the present, but to thoughtfully pass on the future. Claire and I had no children of our body, but we had a family of purpose, a lineage of resilience fostered through the foundation and the fellowships. Yet the physical legacy of Lightkeeper Hill, the stones and soil and the priceless view, needed a steward beyond us. The question of succession was a delicate one. I would not let it become a prize to be fought over, another source of betrayal. The answer came, as the most important ones often did, from a place of memory and instinct. I found it in Sophia, the daughter of that first woman with the garbage bag, the one who now ran the bakery. Sophia had grown up in the orbit of the foundation, a bright, fiercely compassionate child who volunteered in the conservation program through her teens and now, at 25, was completing a dual degree in environmental law and nonprofit management. She had my mother's clear, assessing gaze and a quiet tenacity that reminded me of my own younger self, though she was blessed with a confidence I had never possessed. She loved the estate not as a monument, but as a living system, its ecosystem, its community, its history. Over a series of long conversations on the terrace, watching the light change on the water, I unfolded my idea. Not a bequest, but a proposition. A decades-long mentorship, a gradual transfer of responsibility, a shared vision for the next century of the Lightkeeper's trust. Her eyes, wide with the magnitude of the offer, held not greed, but a profound and solemn understanding. "It's a sacred thing," she said finally, her voice hushed, "to be asked to tend a light." In that moment, I saw the spiral turn again. The inheritance was passing not through blood, but through aligned spirit, through proven character. It was the purest form of my mother's legacy. The process of stepping back was a gentle one. Claire and I built a smaller, modern home nestled in a protected cove a mile down the coast, connected to the main estate by a winding cliff path. We called it the Watch. From its windows, we could see the lighthouse tower, a comforting silhouette against the sky. Moving there was not a retirement, but a repositioning. I remained the chair of the foundation's board, but Sophia's voice became the leading one in its daily symphony. Claire threw herself into writing a definitive book on our coastal ecosystem, her life's work distilled into pages. Our days were full of a different kind of work, thoughtful, reflective, deeply gratifying. On the eve of my 70th birthday, a storm gathered far out at sea. The forecasts spoke of its might, but we were snug in the Watch, the walls braced against the gale. As the wind howled and the waves thundered against the rocks below, Claire built a fire, and I, driven by a sudden impulse, went to the old cedar chest that held the last, most personal fragments of my past. There, beneath the pressed flower from my mother's diary and a sketch Claire had made of the lighthouse, I found it, a small, sealed archival box. Inside was the repaired painting, the Lightkeeper. I had not looked at it directly in years. I carried it to the firelight. The colors were softer now, the varnish mellowed by age. The Lightkeeper's face, once shadowed and stern, seemed to me now to hold a profound patience, a knowledge that the storm was temporary, but the duty was eternal. I traced the crack in the frame, the flaw that had once hidden a world of truth. It was no longer a scar of violence, but a seam of history, the place where my old life had broken open to let this new one spill out. Claire came to stand beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. "He's kept good watch," she said softly. "We all have," I replied. The storm reached its peak near midnight. The power flickered and died, plunging us into a darkness broken only by the fire's leap and the frantic strobe of lightning. In the blackness, I felt not fear, but a strange, exhilarating solidarity with the elements. Then, through the rain-lashed window, I saw it, a steady, rhythmic beam cutting through the chaotic night. The lighthouse. Its backup generators, a system I had insisted on upgrading years ago, had engaged. Its light was unwavering, a metronomic sweep of certainty against the madness of the storm. It was doing its job, autonomously, faithfully, just as it was designed to do. Sophia was likely at the main house, monitoring systems, but the light itself required no human hand now. It had been set on its course, and it held. Watching that faithful beam, a profound completion settled in my bones. This was the full circle. The light was no longer dependent on the keeper in the painting, or on my mother, or on me. It was an institution, and principle made manifest in glass and steel and unwavering light. It would guide sailors and comfort watchers on the shore long after my name was forgotten. I had not just inherited a light, I had helped to build a system that would sustain it. I had moved from being the daughter searching for a key in the dark, to the keeper tending the flame, to the architect ensuring the tower would stand and the lens would turn for generations unseen. The spiral had widened to its outermost reach, touching eternity. Claire took my hand, its veins like maps of our time together, and squeezed. We stood in silence, two old women in a warm room, watching the ancient dialogue between storm and light. There was no more to fight, no more to prove, no more to secure. There was only this: the love beside me, the legacy behind me, the enduring light before me, and the deep, abiding peace of a watch faithfully kept.
The story had begun with a secret and a lie. It was ending, as all the best stories do, not with an ending at all, but with a light burning steadily on a far cliff, a signal that for those still in turbulent waters, a safe harbor always exists, and the dawn, however delayed, is inevitable. Time, in its final chapters, becomes less a river and more a deep, still estuary where the waters of memory and the vast, salt-tanged ocean of the present mingle without clear boundary. The years of the watch were not a dimming, but a distillation, a slow simmering down to essential essences. Claire's book was published to quiet acclaim in specialized circles, a legacy of knowledge as tangible as any monument. My own legacy was lived daily in the sounds that carried up the cliff path, the laughter from the Foundation's summer camps for children, the distant chime from the bell we'd installed in the community garden, the hum of a new solar-powered desalination system funded by the Swiss Trust that provided fresh water for the entire coastal community. Sophia flourished. Under her guidance, the Lightkeepers Trust partnered with international universities, becoming a global case study in integrated humanitarian and environmental stewardship. She would visit us,
her energy both a delight and a gentle reminder of a tempo we had willingly left behind. She called me Gran Evelyn, a title that filled me with a pride more profound than any corporate title ever had. My body began to speak in the subtle language of age, a stiffness in the morning, a need for glasses to see the detailed migration charts Claire still loved to study, a preference for the warmth of the sun on the terrace over the bracing wind on the cliff walk. These were not betrayals, but conversations. I listened and adapted. Claire and I developed rituals as finely tuned as clockwork. Tea at 4, a slow walk to the tidal pools at low tide to see what the sea had revealed, reading aloud to each other in the evenings. Our love, having burned with the bright, steady flame of shared work and passion, now glowed with the deep, enduring warmth of banked coals. We spoke less, yet understood more. A touch of a hand, a meeting of eyes across a room, contained entire dialogues. The past, once a minefield, had become a landscape viewed from a great height. Its contours were clear, its dangers neutralized by distance. I thought of my mother not with the old sharp grief, but with a fond, almost conversational nostalgia. I would tell her about Sophia's latest idea, or complain about the stubbornness of a particular rosebush, as if she were just in the next room. The painting, The Lightkeeper, hung in our small sitting room at the Watch. I no longer searched it for clues or symbols. It was simply a beautiful thing, a companion that had traveled the long road with me. Sometimes, in a certain light, I fancied the expression on the lightkeeper's face had softened from stern vigilance to something akin to contentment. The final turn of the spiral began on an unremarkably beautiful day. The sky was a clear porcelain blue, and the sea lay calm, breathing in long, gentle sighs against the rocks. Claire had gone into the village to deliver a lecture to the new fellows on tidal ecology. I had stayed behind, feeling a rare and delicious laziness. I settled in my favorite chair on the terrace, a blanket over my knees, a journal in my lap, not for writing, but for pressing the first fallen leaves of autumn. The sun was warm on my face, the air crisp with the promise of change. A sense of overwhelming fullness settled upon me, a gratitude so vast it was almost physical. It was not for the big things, the victories, the reclaimed fortunes, but for the tiny, perfect mosaic pieces of my life. The smell of Claire's shampoo on her pillow, the precise blue of the hydrangeas by the gate, the hum of a new solar-powered desalination system funded by the Swiss Trust that provided fresh water for the entire coastal community. I felt a gentle tiredness, not the weariness of exhaustion, but the deep, sweet fatigue that follows a long and satisfying journey. My eyes grew heavy, the brilliant light of the sun-dappled terrace softening at the edges, the sounds of the world, the cry of a gull, the distant chime of the bell, the eternal whisper of the sea, began to blend into a single harmonious hum, like a song heard from far away. And then a curious thing happened. The light seemed to change, not to dim, but to intensify, becoming golden and diffuse, as if the very air was turning to honey. I was not afraid. A profound, welcoming peace enveloped me, deeper than any I had ever known. At the edge of my fading sight, a figure resolved from the light, not the lightkeeper from the painting, but my mother, Marian, as she was in my earliest memories, young, vibrant, her eyes crinkled with a smile that finally, truly reached them. She held out her hand, not in summons, but in invitation. There were no words, but an understanding passed between us as clear as spoken language. The watch is changed, the light is secure. I let go, not of life, but of the final gentle hold on the shore. My last conscious sensation was not an ending, but a merging, a feeling of becoming part of the light warming the stone, part of the salt in the air, part of the steady, rhythmic pulse of the beacon sweeping its eternal arc over the water. It was a homecoming, to a home I had spent a lifetime building. 3. Claire found me as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. She knew instantly, the understanding passing between us, as it always had. There was no cry, only a slow, tender exhale as she kneeled, taking my still, warm hand in hers, pressing it to her cheek. She sat with me as the golden light faded to twilight, keeping her own vigil. My funeral, as I had wished, was not a somber affair in a cemetery, but a gathering of light on the cliffs. At sunset, the entire community, Foundation residents past and present, fellows, villagers, friends, assembled with lanterns and candles. Sophia spoke, her voice steady with the strength I had helped nurture. Claire, my fierce, brilliant Claire, read a poem about the tide, her voice only breaking once. Then, at a signal, they did not extinguish their lights. Instead, they turned and faced the sea, holding them aloft, 100 smaller points of light echoing the great sweeping beam of the lighthouse that had just clicked on for the night. It was a silent testament, a passing of the flame not into darkness, but into a multitude of hands. The official inheritance was executed flawlessly. The watch passed to Claire for her lifetime. The Lightkeeper's Trust, its endowment ironclad, passed to Sophia, not as an owner, but as its lead steward, the first in a line that would be chosen by merit and heart. The painting was bequeathed to the Foundation's main hall with a small plaque that read, "The Lightkeeper," a reminder that our duty is not to own the light, but to ensure it is never extinguished.
But the true inheritance, the one that lives and breathes, is more subtle. It is in the way Sophia pauses on the cliff path, looking out to sea with the same thoughtful gaze I once had. It is in the Foundation's policy, written by her hand, that states no one will ever be turned away for lack of funds. It is in Claire, who still walks to the tidal pools, now often with a young fellow in tow, teaching them to see the universe in a starfish. It is in the unwavering beam that cuts through the stormy night, a promise kept across generations. The story that began with a willful lie in a plush sitting room, with a brother's greed and a husband's betrayal, found its truth not in a courtroom or a bank vault, but here, on these wind-swept cliffs. It proved that a legacy forged in secrecy and love is stronger than one built on theft and arrogance, that a single rusted key can unlock not just a box, but a future, and that sometimes the most insignificant-looking bequest, a faded painting of a man with a lamp, can, when broken open by cruelty, reveal the tools to build a world where light and hope are the only things that are never left to chance. The Lightkeeper's watch continues, the flame passed on, forever burning against the dark. The silence after a great story ends is not empty, it is fertile ground. In the years that followed Evelyn's peaceful passing, Lightkeeper Hill did not become a shrine, but a living testament, its heartbeat echoing the steady rhythm she had established. Claire lived on at the watch, a beloved, sharp-eyed presence who became the estate's unofficial archivist and its most sought-after storyteller. She would sit with the new Marian fellows, not speaking of grief, but of resilience, her anecdotes of Evelyn always punctuated with a wry smile and the phrase, "and then she did it her own way, of course." The love between them, having transcended life, became part of the Foundation's lore, a quiet proof that happy endings are not fairy tales, but choices built day by stubborn day. Sophia, now the lead steward, guided the trust with a wisdom that belied her years, blending Evelyn's fierce compassion with a generational boldness. She leveraged the Swiss Trust's dividends to launch a global digital network, connecting similar sanctuaries worldwide, creating a web of safe harbors that spanned continents. The physical estate thrived. The artist residencies produced work that challenged and illuminated. The conservation area became a benchmark for coastal regeneration. And the community programs were so woven into the local fabric that it was impossible to tell where the Foundation ended and the village began. Evelyn's name was on plaques and in digital donor records,
but her true presence was felt in the culture of the place, in the unwavering commitment to integrity, in the belief that second chances are not charity, but investments in human capital, and in the understanding that true security comes not from high walls, but from leaving the gates open with the light on. A generation later, a young historian named Leo arrived as a Marion Fellow, his project to map the social architecture of intentional communities. He became fascinated by the story of the estate's founding, by the tale of the betrayed twin and the hidden key. In the Foundation's archives, amidst financial records and architectural plans, he found the small archival box containing the repaired Lightkeeper painting. Intrigued, he requested to study it. Given supervised access, he examined it with the detached curiosity of his profession, noting the craftsmanship, the style, the crack in the frame. Using a specialized light, he scanned the back of the canvas, a routine procedure. What he found was not another key or a secret map, but something far simpler and more profound. In the very bottom corner, in minute, almost invisible script, not Marion's hand, but that of the original, long-dead artist, was a single word: perseverance. Perseverance. Leo brought this discovery to Sophia, now silver-haired and steering the trust with a calm authority. She stood before the painting in the main hall, looking at the word revealed by technology that Evelyn could never have imagined. She smiled, a slow, deep smile of recognition. She never saw that, Sophia said softly. She spent her life looking for the secret in the frame. The real secret was always in the art itself. It was the final, perfect note. The painting's truth was not a literal treasure, but its very subject, the steadfastness of the keeper, the enduring act of holding the light. Evelyn hadn't inherited a clue, she had inherited a principle, and in living that principle so completely, she had become it. The story of Evelyn Hales, the wronged twin, eventually faded from public memory, absorbed into the broader, brighter narrative of the Lightkeeper Trust. Tourists visiting the cliffs might hear a simplified version. A generous benefactor left her home for a good cause. But on stormy nights, when the wind rattles the windows of the old main house and the lighthouse beam stabs through the fury, the longer story is sometimes told. A new fellow feeling lost or afraid might be taken aside by a longtime resident. They might be shown the painting, its crack pointed out, and told a tale not of victimhood, but of alchemy. How bitterness can be refined into compassion, how betrayal can be transformed into sanctuary, how a single, seemingly worthless object can contain the blueprint for a revolution of kindness. And in that telling, Evelyn is not a ghost of the past. She is present tense. She is in the warmth of the communal kitchen, in the courage of a resident presenting her first business plan, in the protected stretch of coast where seals now birth their pups. She is in the steadfast beam that never wavers, a promise kept across the decades. The inheritance was never the gold or the property. It was the lesson, now etched into the soul of the place, that darkness is not defeated by a single heroic blow, but by the persistent, daily, quiet decision to kindle a light, and then to build a system, stone by stone, soul by soul, to ensure that light can never be blown out. The watch changes, the keepers come and go, but the light remains.